It's good to see each one of you. This is the last of this series of Philosopher Cafes, and a number of people up here are weeping, and that's very good. Given their comments through the series, I wasn't sure that they had a heart. They spoke out of the power of their mind. I've been, just on a personal note, I have, I'd be interested in how some of the rest of you have experienced this last series, but my sense is that the quality of the conversation, and the thinking together has reached a new kind of level. So I've really appreciated what so many of you have brought to the table, and the care with which you have done it. So that's been a gift to me, and I'm sure to many others. So I thank you. I'm delighted today to introduce Suzette Phillips, who will speak to the theme of our last, or engage us in the last theme around the excellent life. The whole question about whether human beings actually need intimate relationships in order to live the excellent life. I don't know where this question comes from. I think it must come from Martin. Where's Martin?
Right here.
Oh, yeah. It's, but I think given the way in which so many of us in our world think about ourselves, it's an important question, because it does raise the whole matter of who I am and who others are, and what's the relationship between us. So Suzette Phillips did her doctorate at St. Paul's in Ottawa, and I actually met her around that. She did her work around a classic of the spirituality of the Eastern Christian tradition, an extraordinary book called The Way of the Pilgrim, and brought that into discussion with her own work on contemplative psychology. She is a therapist and works for Alberta Health, and also is an adjunct in the occupational health faculty at the University of Alberta. So I'm delighted you're here, and look forward to it.
It's a privilege and honor to come and speak with you today. I'm just going to give you a little bit further background to what David has told you, and then I'm going to give you a few thoughts. And after I give you a few thoughts, I'm going to invite you into some discussion amongst yourselves around the question that we'll be exploring today. Martin, the question is brilliant. Just to begin with, pondering on the question of whether attachments to other human beings are a necessary part of living excellently is an absolutely brilliant question, especially for today, in our day and age when there is so much individualism and narcissism, people living autonomously, and even amidst the busyness and fullness of our lives with so many people that we interact with, living in isolation. It's an absolutely brilliant question. So, in my work and in my life, I've had the privilege of working with many people as a therapist, journey through that question, as they've looked at areas in their own lives where there have been fractures that have led them to have difficult times connecting with other human beings, have difficult times functioning in the way that they'd like to function, have difficult times loving and relating when they desire so impassionately to connect with others. In my work, I've had the privilege of journeying alongside And in my own life, I've had the privilege of exploring within myself what the importance of attachments are, what the importance of trust is amongst people, the importance of speaking and dialoguing, sharing stories, of hearing one another, of spending time, of growing together, of sandpapering with each other, so that we can grow and rub off the rough spots in ourselves. I'm going to start today. Bear in mind, I'm a theologian and a therapist and a philosopher in the true sense of the word, one who loves wisdom. And I'm looking to hear the wisdom that comes from this group, having journeyed together as you have over these last number of weeks. I'm going to start today by posing the question to you before I share any further thoughts, and give you some time at your tables with those that you're sitting with to just dialogue for 5 minutes on the question. And here's the question. Are attachments, deep attachments, to other human beings a necessary part of living excellently? You've been talking about living excellently for these last number of weeks. And I'd like to ask you if you can ponder on that question and just dialogue for a few minutes. And then as we regroup, I'll ask you to just share some thoughts that came up in your discussions, and then we'll go forward from there. So the question again, are deep attachments to other human beings a necessary part of living excellently? So if you can dialogue amongst yourselves, and I'll give you a 1 minute, or David's good at giving a 1 minute ding dong note, I noticed, so he'll give you a 1 minute before we come back again, okay? Are deep attachments to other human beings a necessary part of living excellently? Discussed. What I'm going to ask now is David Go is going to come around with the microphone. He's over there. Just to hear some of the main insights or main thoughts that came up in your discussion. So some key words or key ideas that came up in your small discussions, you can pass that on and share with the group as David comes around. So David's going to start at the back, and we'll hear from the first group.
One of you want to speak to this?
Again, the question is, do you remember the question? Okay. Are deep attachments to other human beings a necessary part of living excellently? First group.
Well, our little group of 5 here seem agreed that they are necessary to learn how to understand people and the world and how to behave. And without those deep relationships, you're left rather adrift. And our discussion then turned to deep relationships with parents. And one of our group spoke about hers. I'm going to turn this over to you so that you can say to everybody what you said to us.
Well, I said, when I was young, I had such loving parents that we came through poverty and war, bombing, and I never felt like I was disadvantaged. I always felt rich and that I had everything, because we always managed to get enough to eat, and we lived till the next morning when the raids were on. And it was all because I had such good parents, I believe. And not only parents, but my aunties and uncles. In the war, you share what you have. And you get close to people that way. Well,
So the closeness then of family and those around us that anchor us so that we don't go adrift and make us feel grounded and comfortable in who we are. Would that summarize what you were indicating? Okay. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, I certainly agree. I think that developmentally, you have to have significant others around you or you wouldn't become human. But once you are an adult, I wonder if there aren't other things you can become equally attached to, or perhaps even more attached to. For example, God.
Computers got brought up over here.
Computers. Perhaps other things like animals, plants. There are a myriad of things that perhaps adults there would be different needs at a different developmental level.
Okay, so initially then, from what I understand you saying that certainly as children, there's a need for other relationships around us to show us what it is to be human, but then as we become more adult, more mature in our lives, that perhaps there are other things or other beings or divine dimension that we attach ourselves to, or plants or animals or other aspects of our life, that we make choices, is what I'm hearing you say, that as an adult we make choices about what we want to be attached to. Would that be it? Thank you.
We did talk a little bit, not too much. Some thoughts come to mind, I hope you agree. One, what does excellently mean? Two, what does deep attachment mean? What are the definitions? When I first looked at the topic, I thought about John Bowlby, a famous psychiatrist, who talks about attachment in a specific way, the goal of which is security. I would suggest that deep attachment or deep relationships or meaningful relationships, it's a sine qua non. It's a without which we cannot live, period. Not just necessary, but we have to have it.
Essential. So not necessary, but essential. So again, deep attachments are not solely about security or things that we need, but rather about our very essential essence or existence. That attachments are essential to who we are. Thank you.
You're not attached to the group, you're only going to speak for yourself. Is that what I heard?
Well, this is a personal observation, and I think it's accurate. I'm convinced it's accurate. And I was always amazed as a phys ed teacher by highly intelligent kids and their performance. I thought far beyond my expectations and the rest of the team. But, and I always thought the basis for this was the fact that it was obvious to me in dealing with them and their parents that there was tremendous love by their parents of these kids. Tremendous love. And they had the composure and the ability to take the stresses and strains of highly competitive moments in the game and produce at that level, which is very, very different than what the normal athlete does. So that I attribute it to that great love that they had between the parents.
So something about deep attachments, fostering love, and being able to enable a person to bloom or to manifest what they can manifest out of their being. That they can excel in ways that one might not think that they could excel, but by this love that's given to them. Would that be what you're alluding to?
I propose to this young man sitting beside me that
Did he accept?
What do you say?
that I've found that deep attachments with other people have allowed me to explore ideas and thoughts that I've had in the security of the relationship. And as you do that, you're always qualifying and defining your thought and I guess your beliefs and values in that, and therefore hopefully acting out of those better understood values and ideas. And we are social beings, so this acting out of that might make you a more tolerant person, a more, a better person in society.
We agreed right off the get-go that you need intimate personal relations, but we tackled the question why.
Did you come up with an answer?
Well, that was the answer.
So the answer being that amidst safe, trusting, deep relationships, one can explore different aspects of life and the world, ask questions, and know that there's the safety of that place to explore from. Was that
And
the
then
answer?
act
And then-
out of the redefined or
And then move forward out of the redefined answer to your question,
Yes.
whatever you were exploring.
yes.
Okay. So we have things about grounding, about the essence, about different stages of development, about this thing about love and how love enables us to become all that we can be, even more than one thinks one can be at times. And the security of being able to explore our world and change and shift and discover new ways of thinking and being.
We raised a question, partly with the assistance of our camera person here, but we raised a question that I think we all hope you'll get into, which is that some people in the quest of their lives, I mean, there's a school of thought anyway, and certainly in Buddhism, that says abjure attachment. So we were talking about what that might or might not mean. But particularly if one was to realize a high pitch of spiritual achievement. So there are people who seem just to leave behind friendships and even attachments with pets and so on. That's a whole batch of things, and I guess we all hope you'll pursue it, or let us all do it together.
I think we'll all do it together. But we'll look at it. So that question of what happens as people enter into different stages of their life and or with align themselves with different philosophical thoughts and theological understandings, different spiritualities, and how does attachment look in those? Because some different schools, for example, Buddhism will call people away from relationships into detachment, whereas, for example, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, people attach to relationships as the parents.
I think we started actually talking about attachment and relationships there, but I think that we kind of agreed that certain kinds of relationships might be necessary to get into a position to live a relationship-free life, and that was where we started wondering how rich or otherwise that life might be.
So do you mean that initially someone developmentally may need relationships, but then as we mature, then there's a choice as to what does that look like after, depending on which way one chooses to journey?
We disagreed. I don't think anyone here would claim to have, to be so enlightened that they could speak to
No.
this. But
The three of us also, I guess, kind of got into definitions at first, just around the idea of intimate and whether you can have kind of deep relationships that have an intimacy to them that's not romantic. It's not so emotional in the romantic way. So we were feeling that it was important and needed to have deep, intimate relationships, but those that aren't necessarily romantic in nature. Is that perceiving right?
Yeah.
And the other thing we just briefly talked about, I guess it kind of gets again onto why. I talked about the experience of happiness, for example, and feeling that to feel that fully, I would say for the most part, I've felt the most, if there's an experience that I've had, I've felt that the happiness of it if I've been able to share that with someone else, to share that moment of happiness with someone else, and that's when I'm able to experience the feeling most. So I just talked about that too.
So questions around, if I could isolate it, questions around what is love? And are there different kinds of what love is or what intimacy is? Are there different ways of expressing connection? So one in a romantic way, perhaps another in a friendship way, perhaps another in a more divine way, depending. Are there different kinds of love, different kinds of attachment? And then what does happiness mean? And is that what the excellent life is? And wanting to share that perhaps with other people, those moments Yeah? Okay.
Okay, well, what we got into is first looking at the question, and then recognizing that there's some assumptions in the question, that attachment recognizes two, or split, or separation. And that if we withdraw ourselves from the assumptions or the binds of the question itself, and question whether relationship is a fact or not. Is not relationship a fact? Is there any one of us that's not related in some way, if we look deep enough? And why do we question that fact? And isn't this question really about special relationships? Relationships, when we say intimate, we're talking that somehow, maybe my relationship with my wife, or with my son, why should that be any more meaningful or have deeper meaning than my relationship with you? Or you? I don't know, but why should it?
Okay, so a question around the question itself, and what does intimate mean? What does relationship mean? Would anyone question whether relationship is really at issue? Seeing as how all of us relate in one way or another, or have had to. And then a question of what defines intimacy, and are there different levels of intimacy, and do they need to be there? That's what I'm hearing. Is it? Well, it could be not what you're saying.
I think that attachment is the wrong word to put the question, that I think should rather be put as one of interaction, as a conversation. So the mutual dependence we have on others and the realization of a more perfect life, I think depends on that interaction. And attachment strikes me as too much of a metaphor of like putting a coat on a hanger. And it misses then, I think, the interactive part of our life and friendship with people. I think we have some different views here too.
I think that what I hear in that is a question about self-implication, as opposed to hanging something on a hook.
No, it isn't self-implication. It's an interaction.
A little closer to your...
Sorry. It's an interaction among people who benefit from the interaction, and thereby, for example, if a farmer and a doctor are exchanging goods in order for both of them to live better, then it's the interaction, I think, that's crucial here, and not the attachment. I think
Is it the interdependency then?
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Another thing we talked about, or I did anyway, is the quality of the attachment, because you can be attached to something or someone that has an extraordinarily negative impact on you as a being. And to me, that is the worst kind of attachment. In fact, it's destructive and stunting. You don't grow. And so I think those should not be indulged in. Or even, I would be I have been out of there. You can't, I think you only have so much time as a being on this earth. And we get back to the Buddhists, you stay around with people who encourage your growth as a human being, in the best sense of the word. And also, it's really interesting because I do try to follow the Buddhist practices and have really wrestled with the whole idea of attachment, because you get to the thinkers like Plato, who talked about you split apart, and the Kabbalah talks about the Beshet and the Besheta and all of that kind of stuff. And even when Jack Kornfield, who's a leading Buddhist writer in the US, when he came back after being 7 years kind of in Asia and alone and all of that kind of stuff, he said he didn't feel he started to practice until he came back to be with human beings, because that's when his practice started to be practiced. So it's really an interesting question, but we also said that we thought attachment was necessary.
So good attachments being necessary and not so good attachments needing to be making choices about in terms of whether to stay in them or not, and that they do have impact on us as a being.
Well,
And
I think
people
they have
make-
really ripple impacts on
Absolutely.
all kinds of...
So rippling impacts throughout life, and certain people like yourself have made choices out of those relationships.
And there's pain attached to that, but you have to look at...
Okay.
And these guys didn't actually...
Yeah, we'll get to that.
This is a very interesting discussion. It's wonderful hearing everybody's thoughts.
If you don't mind, could you repeat the question? Because it's been so far away from where we are
Yes.
now.
Are deep attachments to other human beings a necessary part of living excellently?
Okay, I'll try to recapitulate what my colleagues and I came up with, and that was 5 minutes. It just felt like about 30 seconds.
Isn't it?
And could you guys please jump in and refine anything I have to say? Okay, first of all, we agreed with almost everybody that it's an age-specific matter, a developmental matter, that what one needs, the quality of intimacy that one needs as an infant and a child could be quite different than in later life. So we discussed that a bit, and then we went into the Buddhist Hindu perspective that that people who come back different lifetimes might have different needs depending on their quote-unquote spiritual development. Hence we talked about Buddha, and after he was roughly in his early 20s, I believe, people can correct us, he was able to go out on his own, and he had students and followers, and he had possibly one person with whom he had, let's call it a platonic, an agape type relationship, but certainly nothing erotic. And we don't even know the nature of that particular relationship, but he was not needy of the kind of intimacy that most of us would need. And you know what? The same thing applies to Jesus, really, when you look at his life and his needs. And there are talks, there is information now about a young Buddhist, a young fellow in India who's kind of like a new Buddha, who lives alone and meditates all the time. And that would be kind of like the Mozart effect. He's even from a quite young age, like 6, 7, he's been meditating under a lotus tree. So it's lifetime specific, age specific. The other thing was we did go into all the inherent problems with the question itself. In other words, who defines excellence? And one of my colleague friends said that it should really come from the person who is living that life, for example. And how does that person, and it was mentioned, for example, when you go into graduate studies and you spend 3, 4 more years in graduate studies, your goal in a way and your happiness is based on achievement. It's not, and you might put aside social activity for a large part of that time, for example. And I'll let you elaborate on that. And I'd like to just add this, the gentleman back there talking about security, attachment. I think it would be helpful for all of us to look at the obverse of that, or the opposite of that. In other words, abandonment. Because in psychiatric literature, abandonment is huge when you're a child. But I would argue that it continues, that we should look at suicide and the suicides that are attributed to, call it loneliness, but it's really not just simply loneliness. And that would help us with this discussion. And also alienation, but not necessarily alienation in the Marxist sense, but maybe alienation more in a psychological sense. And that part about, do you want to add to that? No, that's about it.
It's a mouthful to try and summarize. So again, looking at the, so this group, did they want to?
No, they were part of this group here. You'll dip the Zora in
When it's time.
next level of the discussion.
So from your group then, looking at the ways that there are parts of it that are developmental, but again, it's an individual, depending on where the person is and who they are and what they've lived. again, the element of choice and what the excellent life looks like for that person, and it being a necessary part of what someone chooses, depending on what they're living and experiencing at that point in their life. So those essential kind of components about what the question is. In brief.
Sure.
Okay. How was that as a discussion for you? Was that comfortable?
Awesome.
Okay. How many of you, on a scale of 0 to 10, if 0 means that you believe that attachments are not necessary, 0 is they're not necessary at all, 10 is deep attachments to other human beings are an essential part of an excellent life. If 10 is an absolute yes and 0 is an absolute no, what number are you at? As individuals, as people, just pop up numbers for me. Just say numbers. 4, 9, 7, 6, 8, 10. An 11 came from back there. I think an 11 would be over here too. Any other numbers? Anyone at a 0? Sorry? You're at a 0 that deep attachments to other human beings are not an essential part of the excellent life. That's what you would say. Okay. That's fair.
Is there a problem with that, though?
Is there a problem with what?
Is there a problem with that if you say that it's possible to have 0 attachment? Oh, sorry. If you say it's possible to have an excellent life with 0 attachment, isn't there a problem with that? Because what we're saying is an excellent life is certain things. We've been discussing it for the past few weeks. And these certain things cannot be achieved. Those certain things cannot be achieved without other humans. I could have an excellent life if I was raised in the jungle, but the quality of that excellent life wouldn't be the quality of my life if I was raised with humans. So by that definition, 0 does not apply, should not apply. So yes, we need other people. We always will need other people, which is what made us human to begin with. We cannot be human without other people. I think that. I don't know if anyone else believes that. So as long as you have humans that are necessary, the 0 thing is sort of an artifact.
At the same time, we each have our own different ways of looking at things. So I do want to respect your 0, and it would be interesting to hear what your 0 is about. Would you mind sharing with us some of your thoughts?
Well,
David's coming.
I guess we've had the argument of the feral child, right? And I recognize that, you have the argument of the feral child, and you've had the argument of the individual. So if it's the individual judging their own life, and they are a feral child, and it's the only thing they know, how do they know anything different? So that is the best possible life they could have. If you're born without the ability to speak, hear, or see, and you can't form a deep human attachment through any standard communication means, and that's the best possible life you can have, then you've had that life. I think that you're into a positive-negative conundrum here with anyone who decides consciously to be a hermit or exclude themselves from social existence. I'm thinking of that fellow who spent all that time up in Alaska building himself that cabin. He seemed perfectly happy to me with his wood tools and the cabin he built and the movie he made that I think many people have seen on PBS. But I guess if the broad question is public life as opposed to a solitary life, then I would have to go on the 10 scale in keeping with the question and the theme. But I would have to go on a 0 scale if it's going to be an exclusionary question.
We're all sitting here very comfortable, but if I'm absolutely starving, I can have all the intimate relationship I want. I'm not going to have a happy, excellent life.
That brings up my question for you. And I haven't had the privilege of being here for the last number of weeks, so it's my place to ask the question of what is the excellent life that we're all striving for? Or what does the excellent life mean? So you've been here, so illumine me. In words, what does it mean to have an excellent life? I have some presuppositions, but what have you come together as a consensus?
No, I don't know if there is a
No consensus. So share some words. If you just had, I just want to hear words, if people can just speak them. What are the words?
That's tea with friends.
To have steeped tea with friends. The excellent life. What else makes the excellent life?
Happiness.
Happiness? What makes happiness? Sorry?
joy.
Joy? What makes joy?
Love has been left out the whole time.
No, we had love back there. It came out.
Love way back when.
Love way back when, that's it. So love is something about it. Yourself? Inner peace. What else is the excellent life?
Community.
Community.
Sense of fulfillment.
Sense of fulfillment.
I think one theme that has come up is that the excellent life is the examined life in the Greek.
The examined
Greek
life.
sense.
The reflected on life.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. What else is the excellent life?
I would say it includes all of Maslow's triangle. You can't leave out
All of Maslow's hierarchy of need.
hierarchy of needs, and there's a lot of literature that says that belonging and the trust that comes with belonging is hardwired. The need for belonging. There's a lot of literature that speaks of the need for belonging and the trust that comes with belonging is hardwired, and for love. So I think we need to look at that as part of the triangle.
I think balance is very important, particularly with respect to the issue of attachments. Will I explain that really quickly? Without referencing the sordid details of my own life, I just think that with respect to what a couple of people...
You embody, you are a witness.
Anything you say there. The thing about attachments, as a couple of people have already said here, is that although we tend to think of attachments in terms of love and fulfillment, that in my life at least, attachments have often led to a lot of pain, misery, and sense of betrayal and distrust. And I think most people who go through a normal family experience or formal group experience of any sort obviously learn that group attachments and intimacy has strongly negative as well as strongly positive possibilities. So I think in terms of attachments and the excellent life, and I can relate to the gentleman who kind of put himself as number one, because it's a dialectical relationship, in my view, between the individual and the group. And there are times when the individual needs the group for sustenance, to get values, but there's also times when the individual has to be thrown on his or her own resources when it's necessary to swim against the tide, and it can become very lonely and disheartening when you have to do that. And to add further complication to this problem, I think there are gender differences as well. I think the way that males and females perceive the issues of attachment are different. I think we're socialized as males for independence, and it's the old story when I'm out in the car with my wife and I get lost, as I frequently do. She says, pull over and ask that guy over there. He'll be able to put us right. And my reaction is, to hell with it, I'm going to figure this out myself. Because she's ready to network and she's ready to use the resources of the community, and I'm not. I want to figure it out. I don't want to put myself in a subordinate situation to some jerk who's walking me up. It's a dialectical relationship between the individual and the group, and it can be painful, actually, to negotiate through that.
It can be extremely painful. Thank you for sharing that.
And the jerks are always just too knowledgeable. You know, in Turkey, or not in Turkey, but in Romania, one of the nice things about asking people in Romania, like Bucharest, directions, is that they will always give you directions. It has nothing to do with whether they know where you need to go. It has to do with their sense that they are obliged to give you directions. So I tried to find a Photoshop for 2.5 hours following the directions of, following the networking thing. So maybe you and your wife should go to Romania.
So another thought about what is the excellent life.
You said that you were not familiar with the format that had been used in the previous discussions, and I just want to perhaps remind some of the people in the group, and perhaps you as well, that there was a presentation by the speaker, and then there was reaction, and there were some excellent arguments and some very good questions. I'm afraid that this reminds me of one of the hundreds of workshops that I attended, where the leader asked the questions and people responded, but the leader didn't really have very much to say. And I just wonder if really we're going to hear your opinions as a presentation, because I hate workshops. I've had too many of them.
That's fair. I think in response to that, yes, you will hear from me. I think for me, as I mentioned, I'm a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. And so I know that this group has been meeting for a long time. You've been talking about the excellent life, and you have your own thoughts. You've lived life. You have attachments. You know parts of this question. And for me to not hear you would be to not respect your attachments. To not respect you. Oh, you'll hear from me.
No, I wanted you first and then us.
I'm wondering, we're at 2 o'clock now, and you take a break normally at?
2:15.
2:15.
2:20.
Would you like to hear some of my thoughts before your break or after?
Yeah.
Before? Before. Okay, here we go. You ready? Okay, fasten your seatbelt, because there's been a lot of wonderful thoughts and reflections. I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts from both the developmental. I would echo many of the things that have been said here, first and foremost. One point that was made is, is there anything, are we human if we aren't relational? I personally would suggest and posit that in our essence as human beings, ontologically, in our beingness, we are essentially relational. And I'm going to move out of that premise, okay? And I'm going to move out of that premise from a variety of perspectives. One, from a developmental perspective, and also from a theological and philosophical perspective. From an anthropological perspective, which I'll go to first, theological anthropological perspective, my belief as a Christian, and I'm coming as a Christian, and as a Catholic and an Eastern, Western Catholic Christian, my foundational belief is that we are created according to relationship. In the system of my thought, which is going to be different than some of your thoughts, I believe that God is a personal God. And God created human beings in a personal way, according to a personal God who is triune. That's my premise. I don't know how that fits with your premise, but that's mine. When I look at people around me relationally, in terms of how we are humanized, I don't know that anyone here hasn't had a mother and a father. I don't know that anyone wasn't created biologically in union between a mother and a father, in one form or another, however that manifests today with our scientific developments and advances, right? But that there is in our essence, in who we are as human beings, a relational element. We're born into relationship. We develop amidst relationship. Our being comes into being within relationship. We bond with our mother first and our father. We get a sense of belonging or don't get a sense of beingness and belonging, depending on what our life experiences have been, within those relational contexts. We learn, and I'm going to give you some B's that come out. Each word starts with the letter B, and they're part of each of our development. Being, bonding, belonging, blessing, balance, boundaries, becoming. Each of us becomes in a certain context, for better or for worse. There's sometimes where our life experience fractures us and wounds us. There's sometimes where our life experience calls us forth in our becoming so that we can unfold in who we are in our essence. Uniquely, individually, in our persons, in who we are, in the essence of who each of us is, regardless of the culture we come from, our age, our background, our philosophical or religious beliefs. That each of us becomes who we are in those contexts. Like I say, there can be times where we're fractured, and there are times that we're enriched. As we're enriched, we become more secure. It was mentioned that Bowlby talks about attachment theory. Bowlby was one of the founders of attachment theory, and he spoke about the ways in which the bond between a mother and a child starts to form connection and security, as was mentioned, and that as a child becomes more and more secure within that attachment bond, that the child can become more creative, can become more open, and can expand and grow into who that individual, that person is. So in terms of human development, we know scientifically, we know from research and evidence-based practice, that attachment is essential. And we hear when children don't thrive. We've heard that phrase, failure to thrive. We hear it in children, we hear it in seniors, we hear it in those who are ill, who can't claim life anymore, who pull back from life and won't attach. And in fact, one of the signs of a failure to thrive is detachment. The person won't attach for whatever reason. And often they can't speak or tell us why they can't attach. So attachments are essential to who we are in our essence. Relationship is essential to who we are as social creatures, as social persons, however we live that, and from whatever perspective we come. Certainly we know developmentally that children need a space to grow in, a space to belong in and become and unfold, and to know how to trust and connect with other human beings. Certainly we then come to a spot where we make choices. Many of us make choices. Some have the capacity to, better than others, and some don't have as much capacity to make choices. Some don't have the capacity intellectually or don't have the functional capacity. Some are left with disabilities in one way or another. I'm going to posit, though, that those individuals that struggle because of either fractures in their developmental life or fractures in their abilities, whatever that might be, are still persons that grow forward and are unique, loved human beings, just like the rest of us. And that each person is unique, is not replaceable, and I'm going to suggest that they are not replaceable and unique because they are loved. John Zizioulas is an Orthodox theologian. I don't know if anyone's familiar with John Zizioulas. Is that a familiar name? My husband raises his arm at the back. Hi, Andrew. John Zizioulas posited, a brilliant theologian, that being, human beingness, is communion, is attachment. That's what is essence of our being. And as being, we move towards love. And our movement towards love, and this goes back to your question here, is around what does the excellent life move towards? If the excellent life, for me, moves towards love, what does love mean? If it moves towards wisdom, what does wisdom mean? If it moves towards joy, what does joy mean? For me, as theologian and as Suzette, as the person who I am, with my beliefs, I move towards love and towards wisdom, towards beingness, towards virtuousness, in a way that is Christian, that is Christ-like, that embodies the characteristics of Christ. Virtuous characteristics. When I make a choice in my maturity state, right now, not in my child state, but in my adult state, having had the privilege of going through the bumps of life, for good and for ill, having come to this spot where I am right now, being able to choose which direction I want to become and how I want to live excellently, I can choose to love or not. I can choose to become virtuous and humble and free and caring and compassionate and truthful, or I can become untruthful, hurtful, vengeful, and all the other unfriendly words that I don't want to consider too much. I have the choice at this stage of my life, having come out of the life that I have so far, and the privileged life that I have so far, to choose and orient my will. And we talked a little bit, or there was a discussion a bit about free will. I make a choice, you make a choice in terms of what you or I want to become. Who do I want to be? How do I want to be? How do I want to relate? And part of my relating and my becoming is sandpapering with those people around me. I'm not always the most patient person in the world. My husband will attest to that. But it's in relationship with my husband, it's in relationship with people around me that I'm put in spots where my patience is tested. Have you ever been in those spots? And in the relationship, the sandpapering, one with the other, I get buffed. I get polished. My patience gets honed. In relationships, I'm not always the most loving. I'm not always the most patient and kind. I don't always think the best. But it's in those contexts with my husband and with people around me that I have deep attachments with, both attachments that are agape love, platonic, and those that I have intimate relationships with, like my identical twin sister, like my spouse, like my dear friends, like my parents, that I can sandpaper that all the more, and am sandpapered whether I want to be or not. I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily go running after opportunities to be sandpapered. But in the midst of communion, in the midst of relationships, in the midst of attachments, checks and balances happen, and I'm called forth to be the best person I can be. Sometimes I'm put in situations where I could become the worst person I could be. And I have a choice to orient my will one way or another, both psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and with my free will. And I think what's at issue here in terms of deep attachments is you and I each have deep attachments, is what I'm going to posit. If we don't have deep attachments at this stage in our life, it's because we have chosen not to. Or it's because we've chosen to try, and we've been stung and burned so many times that we've pulled back from relating because relationships hurt. That's a different stance. And that one needs to be respected too, because many of us have been hurt to the point where we don't want to risk relationships again. But it's only in the risking relationships again that that wound gets healed. We get sandpapered again. And we can actually become who we are. The alternative is what? The alternative is a hardening of heart. The alternative is a wounding of spirit and a pulling back from life, and perhaps a failing to thrive. And failing to thrive might look different. Some of us might want to thrive but not be able to thrive because we've been hurt in relationships. But that doesn't mean that deep attachments aren't an essential part and a necessary part of the excellent life. It means that we have a few blocks to get through so that we can get there. I'm going to posit that relationship is essential to who we are. It's part of our essence. And our freedom is to choose to be interrelational, interdependent, to be in dialogue with another and others, or to not. And that's our free will. And you and I each have a choice. We each have freedom, and that's part of how we're made. Is not only do we have the essence of being relational, but we have the choice as to how we want to become. How we want to become is essentially each of our free will. I know my choice for myself in my life is to become fully relational. From a Christian context, for me to pull back from and detach from relationships would be to not become fully who I am. And that's because from a Christian perspective that I come from, it's to be virtuous in the way of being relational as our God, my God, is relational and triune. And that means that essentially I am created relational. From a Buddhist perspective, that may be different. And we can talk about that after you have a break. I'll share more thoughts with you later. I'll leave those thoughts with you for right now and leave you hanging. How's that feel?
So 15, 20 minutes for to refresh your tea, and then we'll come back. Thanks.
So I hope that you had some interesting discussions in the meantime. I have some thoughts that I'd like to share, and then I'm looking forward to hearing what your burning questions are after, because I'm sure that there are some. I just wanted to look at the question that's popped up in my own being about the opposite of the excellent life. Because I think that there are a number of things that happen in and through our upbringings, in and through our time of attachment, through our childhood years, through our developmental years, that can color our glasses, that can color our perspective of what we anticipate life will be like. There are many times in a person's life, or many people that I've encountered and journeyed with, whose glasses, their outlook on life, the glasses that they look through when they see themselves, when they see others, when they see relationships, when they see God, however they interpret God to be, that their glasses are tinted because of life experiences. Tinted because of wounds, of hurts, of fractures that have happened within us, where perhaps trust has been violated fundamentally and profoundly. And because perhaps trust has been fractured in profound ways, they have difficulty trusting another relationship, risking attaching to someone else, risking attaching to another human being who they can see, let alone risking trusting a God who one can't always see or touch. So sometimes our life experiences lead us to this spot of having, shall I say, clouded or colored glasses. And I might look at myself having been fractured. Maybe if I heard the message that children are to be heard or to be seen but not heard. You heard that one before? Yeah. I just put myself in a spot of a child because I know many people have grown up with that line of children are to be seen but not heard. And if one's left with that little voice in the back of one's head, one can grow to be shame-based, where one's being isn't supposed to be heard or seen or valued. We live in a profoundly shame-based society right now, and shame-basedness often leads to narcissism and individualism, and or a variety of other directions. But one of the things that it can profoundly lead to is narcissism and individualism. Because if I'm shame-based and I'm not supposed to be heard or seen or relate or attach, then I'm going to be very autonomistic. And I'm not going to risk going out there. So what I might do is I might build a wall around myself to protect myself. In the traditions, I'm going to say traditions because this idea is found in many different traditions, not just the tradition that I'm going to speak from. But there is a word we use in the Eastern Christian tradition called philosophia, which means false self-love. A love of a false self, in essence. And if I put it in a shame-based context, it would be a love of a shame-based self, protecting my shame-basedness, acting out so that I retain and protect my glasses that say that I'm not good enough. Does that make sense? Yeah. So philosophia often gets born from my woundedness. It's part of me that gets imprisoned, that's wounded from fractured relationships. So instead of me moving out of my true self, that might be nurtured and encouraged to come forth by families and people that I'm attached to so that I can be the best person that I can be and do all that I can do and become all that I can be, I might be bound inside by this false construct of that I'm not good enough, I don't have a right to be, I'll never measure up, nothing I do will ever be good enough. Those kinds of ideas are what is left in this thing called philophtia. Now, many of us have this thing called philophtia within us, though we don't necessarily realize that it's there. Have you ever done the things that you don't want to do and don't do the things that you wish you would have done? No? Never? You know that tension inside? The not doing the things that I want to do, that I want to become, but I can't do, I'm going to suggest are because something in us is imprisoned by this thing called philophtia. That time when I do the thing that I don't want to do might be because I'm moving out of philophtia instead of out of my true self. Are you with me? Now, I have a choice in my life, and you have a choice. Now, that term, philophtia, is a Greek term, and it isn't common as that word in English or in any other particular tradition, though you will find in Buddhism and Sufism and Christianity very similar terms. And you'll also find it in psychology. And you'll find it also in narcissism and individualism. And you'll find it in spades in our society today, because we're a shame-based society. Now, you and I have a choice. Do you think our essence is to be bound by philophtia? How do you think philophtia interrelates with relationality? How do those two things go together? Do they? Philophtia pulls me away from relationships. It pulls me away into myself. It pulls me away into isolation so that I can protect my false way of being. Perhaps my addictive patterns, whatever those are. So philophtia actually causes me to individualize, to withdraw, to detach, to protect my wounded self or my vulnerable self that has never had a chance to actually become. Okay? So what philophtia does is pulls me away from relationships. It doesn't allow me to actually enter into deep relationships. There's a reason that philophtia is born, and it's because we've been in relationships where we've been fractured. That colors our lenses. That colors the way I look at you and me, the way I look at relationship, the way I look at God. I have a choice as an adult to be able to become my true self, my true essence of who I am. The true essence of who I am is my true self, that may or may not have been encouraged to unfold as I was growing up as a little one, that may or may not have been encouraged to become and unfold as I was in relationships that were fracturing me. I have a choice at this stage in my life, as do each one of us, to become and orient ourselves in whatever direction we want. So I can choose at this stage, as I mentioned before we took the break, to become loving and truthful and free, and whatever I believe for me the excellent life is, or I can choose to allow philophtia to continue to cloud my vision and my glasses and hold me in my fractured, wounded, addictive patterns. Doesn't sound so pretty, does it? And you know what? The journey is not for the faint of heart. It's each of our journey. Whether we want to see it or not, whether we want to choose it or not, is up to us. But for you and I, today is the first day of the rest of our lives. Yeah? Is that fair? So how you and I choose to become and unfold in days ahead and live the excellent life, whatever that is for you or for me, is our choice. It's our freedom to go in one direction or another. Our choice to continue to be clouded by whatever lies might be on our glasses, whatever false messages might be on our glasses, whatever untruths or whatever truths might be on our glasses. Knowing that every truth that we live at every moment in our own existence is relative to what's on my glasses. So I have a choice at this stage, as do you, in terms of how I want to live my excellent life for the rest of my life. To choose to be bound by this thing that I might not even know is there, that's causing me to live out of different patterns, that might hold me back from living the excellent life, or even recognizing that the excellent life is possible, or what the excellent life might even look like. Because there are multiple kinds of blindness, and multiple kinds of deafness, and multiple kinds of dumbness. And it isn't all about our physicality, but sometimes our emotionality can be stunted at various ages, as can our spirituality, as can our resilience, as can who I am as a person. I can be halted, even though I'm 45, I can be halted in my age by wounds that have happened to me years ago. I can be moving in relationship with other people, out of an emotional stance that might be 3, because I might not have attached at age 3. And that might color my perspective about how I'm going to attach or not attach to other people in my life, and or to my God. Those things can all impinge what goes on in relationships around me. So you and I have a choice in terms of our life, how we want to live. We can be bound by philophtia, or we can allow cracks to be punctured into that wall that we build around our heart to protect ourselves, or so we think, that actually protects a false construct of who you and I are. Or we can allow the chisels to come in so that our true self can actually come out, and we can discover who we are in our essence and who other people are in the essences that they are, and encourage and foster that growth and that becoming in one another. And that happens in the context, I'm going to posit, of relationship and deep attachment, because it's in those places, as you mentioned, where we're in attached relationships that are intimate, where we can trust and be vulnerable enough to risk allowing philophtia to reveal itself. So that I can look at what reaction just came out of me in my thoughts, in my words, in my feelings, in my behaviors, and go, where did that come from? And then I can question it and be sandpapered so that I can be refined. So that perhaps where I haven't been loving, I can become loving. Perhaps where I've been angry, I can be compassionate. Perhaps where I've been impatient, I can be profoundly patient. Perhaps where I've been self-absorbed, I can be other-oriented. Perhaps where I've been withholding, I can give. And perhaps where I've been closed, I can be receptive. Perhaps in being stunted, I can bloom and become all that I have been created to be, and all the gifts that have been given to me can be manifested fully, so that, like the athletes that a gym teacher works with, that I can bloom and become fully equipped and do things that one might not even think possible. You and I have potential within us that often gets bound by things that have happened in our lives, and our potential gets stifled. If we allow ourselves to discover who we truly are in our essence and in relationships, and explore how attachments have been either hurtful or helpful, we're going to be able to become fully who we are in our freedom and make choices in our freedom. So I'll open up the floor now to some discussions, and Martin has his hand up first. You beat y'all to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not coming from a Christian perspective on this.
Okay.
I think I'd rather put forward a kind of stoic perspective, because I think it differs substantially from yours, and I think it's worth contrasting. First of all, the Stoic would say that there's a big difference between being related and in relationships and being attached. When you're talking about deep attachments, the Stoic is going to become very suspicious. Relationship to others, of course, the Stoic accepts. I think Stoic would go along with your view that human beings are by their very nature related to other human beings, and indeed to the whole natural universe. But the point about attachments for the Stoic is that in attaching yourself to other people or to other things, and I think you agree with this, you make yourself vulnerable. You can be deeply hurt by this. The Stoic thinks that that is a reflection of the fact that you have not sufficiently matured. The thing is that you need to cultivate being related to other people without being attached to them, so that you do not, in fact, make yourself vulnerable in the sense that it strikes deep into yourself in any way whatsoever. I think the Stoic would go along with some of the things that other people have been saying here, which is that it's true that early in life you depend upon attachments, and you naturally are attached to your parents. But to carry this on into mature life is something that is, sort of juvenile. You should attempt to get over the kind of attachment that you had to your parents and the need for such an attachment. Personally, I think that there's a lot of truth in this. I mean, it seems to me that it's seeking that attachment that you either had to your parents or that you didn't have, right? More often, I think it's an attachment that you didn't have, which ruins your relationships to adults in adult life. So the Stoic opts for a detachment from other people and from all other things, is so that you can properly relate to them as a whole human being and not some sort of wounded beast.
I guess my resonance with the Stoic exists. However, my question for the Stoic would be, out of which motivation is that Stoic moving? Because the motivation will either come from philothea or will come from the true essence of the self. And appropriate attachment will grow with our maturity. When we're a child, we need what a child needs. As we mature and as we age, our relationships shift. The dynamics of relationships shift. So that we shift from dependence into interdependence. So my resonance with the Stoic would be, of course, relationships are at a mature level as we're mature. However, my question around the guarding of self and the non-attachment so that one does not get hurt and doesn't be vulnerable, relationships implicitly, deep attachments implicitly require self-implication. They implicitly require that I am vulnerable on one level or another. After you, Martin.
Yeah, well, that's what the Stoic would disagree with. I mean, it's true that for most people, that's true, right? But the Stoic thinks that you can have very fruitful relationships with other people without that vulnerability. Now, the Stoic would agree with you that, most people can't achieve that. But the Stoic sage, who is the person who lives the excellent life, has achieved it. And so even with children and spouses, the Stoic sage is at that point where it doesn't matter I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. What it means is that the person is not self-implicated in the other person, so that if the other person dies or betrays them or something of that sort, they feel like their own life has been devalued in some way. That's...
Yeah, and I would come back with that too, Martin. I'm not suggesting that in a Christian context that there is a codependence. So I would say that for someone who has matured, and this goes into a question I have in terms of, we've almost shifted a little bit in terms of what kind of development we're talking about in terms of spiritual development or intellectual development or which level. Does the Stoic sage, for example, still believe that relationships are important? And I'm not familiar with what the aim of the excellent life is for the sage, for the Stoic sage, and if you could clarify
Yeah,
that.
well, certainly, but to live a wise, rational life, which is what the excellent life is for the Stoic, is to relate to other people in a wise and rational way, and help them where they need help in their proper enterprises, and cooperate. No, that's all part of Stoicism.
So it is relational and interdependent.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who would like to pick up on this particular theme?
Thank you. I wonder if the person with Philip here would benefit from forgiveness and the Stoic would benefit from selflessness for the same reason.
Say that again.
Would the person with Philip here benefit from forgiveness for the hurt that's caused? Well, I'm not saying that it's easy to achieve or not, but I think it would be necessary. And perhaps the Stoic would benefit from selflessness for the same reason.
Interesting comment. I'll ponder on that.
Well, I have a little different story. And I think life is like an ocean. And we are little sailboat, which are being built all over the place in little safe havens. But the life of a sailboat is not to stay in port all the time, and is to go out and challenge the water, explore the sea, and get bashed. It happens. So sometime when they're really bashed, they go back to port, they get reattached, get refitted, and so on, and then they move on again. And, yes, you form attachment, but nothing is permanent, nothing is forever. You will take the attachment that you have with you in the high sea, and when the wind bashes you or throws you about, eventually sometime either you flounder and sink, or you make it back to port and get refitted again. What's the moral of the story? I think we should try to find a compromise between what you call the Christian tradition and the Buddhist tradition. There is a time in our life when we sit in port and get refitted, and there's a time in our life where we're up in the high sea. With that in mind, I want to ask you a question. You were talking about relating to people and being vulnerable. Have you ever asked yourself, what have you got to lose in being vulnerable?
Would you like an answer to that? First of all, I think it's a question that each of us needs to ask is what do we have to lose in being vulnerable? I think the story of the boat is really profound. Thank you. Because part of our development, as I gave you the B's, do you remember the being, bonding, belonging, blah, blah, blah? Part of it is blessing. And in the blessing, as I see the blessing, it's actually to go out onto the high seas and to bring our life and our giftedness into the world and to see where it takes us. And yes, we do get bashed around a little bit. And there is no control. And life has its way with us. If we have been given a blessing through our life, where people have said, I believe in you, I trust in you, I hope in you, I delight in you, look at all your gifts, go. Isn't that a wonderful thing to hear? How many of us haven't heard that? And how essential is that message? I love you, I believe in you, I hope in you, I delight in you, I'm behind you, I back you, go.
I disagree with you completely.
Do you?
Yeah. You might have had a good start, which happens, but I mean, it's accidental. Where you really prove yourself is in the high C.
Oh, absolutely.
And at that point, there is nobody behind you, and there's nobody in front of you. So you're on your own. If you survive the first storm, hey, you made it. You got yourself on the back, go back to shore, buy a new sail, and go out again. And you can bash the game eventually, or whatever, it doesn't matter.
And what that does, though, the blessing actually affords us something, and it's called agency, or a locus of control, where those things that have been given to us externally all of a sudden become, in our development, internalized. So those messages come from outside of us that say, I'm believed in, I'm hoped in, I'm delighted in, I've been seen, I've been known, I've been heard. And that gives us the courage and the agency, the locus of control, to actually go out and weather the storm. So there are these external things that actually become internalized, so that my essence of self has become. So I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying that that's what I'm saying.
I'd like to go back, if it's okay, to when you were talking about shame-based society, shame-based culture. Because I heard a really great presentation by a psychologist whose thesis, am I doing something wrong here?
You're in front of the speaker.
Whose thesis in doctoral studies was in shame-based stuff, Brene Brown. And one of the examples she gave of in her presentation was basically perfectionism. And I was thinking of all my academic colleagues and how perfectionism is a disease in academia, where you have to be right all the time, and you have to do everything perfect.
Because?
Well, peer-based reviews, but go ahead.
Well, no, it's also another part of shame-basedness. If my being isn't right, then I have to do it right in order to prove that I am right.
That's right.
That I am okay. So
That's
I have
right.
to become all the more excellently perfected.
That's right. Yeah. And it's instead of the old, I forget the name of the sociologist, instead of inner direction and authenticity, it's outer directed by the reactions you get from society and your friends and whomever.
David Reese.
David Reese, of course. And her antidote to this was worthiness. The worthiness leads to love and belonging. And longing and love and belonging are what help to create worthiness. If you don't have it, you not only as a child, but getting that nurturing and that training past adolescence, you'll have trouble, and it'll always be inauthentic and other-directed rather than coming from an authentic self. But if anybody's interested in that topic, Brene Brown, Brene with a B.
As in boat, as in all the bees.
Oh, that's right.
Just 1 second.
Maybe this is the time to expand some of that sense of the storms of life or the sunshine. I heard quite a lot about freedom. You can choose to be yourself or not. And from a theological perspective, there are other views. And I'm thinking particularly of the theology of grace. You can't save yourself. You have to depend on grace. And it's something you may take in, but it's not you exactly. It's something that comes to you. Perhaps the term blessing, which you used, has a relationship to that concept of grace. And I just wonder if you'd like to try to define what how you balance or how you interrelate the sense of freedom, which I suppose has a place in the argument, and the sense of blessing or grace.
I haven't used a word yet, and I've been waiting for that comment to come up to throw it out there, so thank you for raising it. The word is synergia, which is a Greek word that means synergy. As an image, it's a theological term. That is a dance, shall I say, a dance of grace between God's initiative and our response. Theologically and in theological anthropology, from a Christian perspective, one of the things that makes human beings unique is that we've been given free will. We can choose. And that's a profound gift. I can choose to be this or that. I can choose to orient myself in one way or another. I can choose. At the same time, I can choose to dance with God's grace and accept it or not. And part of the gift of synergia is that God initiates first. Grace comes first. Grace blesses. Grace extends an invitation. And sometimes God invites us into the dance of life that looks like a cha-cha, and sometimes it's a polka, and sometimes it's a waltz, and sometimes I step on God's toes. In my freedom, I can respond and enter into the dance, or in my freedom, I can choose to sit it out. And so from a theological perspective, yes, I can enter in. Sometimes, however, my free will can be paralyzed by philosophia. Because many times the way that I interpret who God is based on relationships that I've had with fathers and mothers and authorities. And if I've been told, for example, that children are to be seen but not heard, I might not be able to even go there. If I've been hurt by a father figure and my image of God is God as Father, I might not trust God as Father, so I won't go there because I think that God's going to treat me the same way that my father did. So therefore I won't risk the relationship, in which case I won't receive the grace or the blessing that God might want to give me. I won't even want to enter into the dance. So yes, there is this element of grace, profound element of grace, and this wonderful gift of synergia. There are three things that I posit theologically. One, that I am created, and I believe all of us are created according to the image and likeness of a triune God that's very personal, that loves us, and that wants us to be all that we can be. I also posit that synergia is the dance of grace between us, and that fundamentally we're created relational. Those are my Christian perspectives that might bounce against the Stoics, and that's okay. But so yes, grace is fundamental to that.
I think we have a couple of millennia of argument over that relationship between grace and freedom. And I admit that my view is heavily colored partly by my temperament and partly by my encounter with Master Calvin. So that there might be some differences of opinion there. But thanks for the explanation.
My mind's really turning around because I think sometimes, like getting back to your boat, we go off without anything. We go off without any encouragement, anything except something inside us propels us to go or we'll die. That's been true for me. And it's really come from internally, not externally, just a pull. And I also feel deeply connected to the rhythm and the mystery of life itself. I cannot believe in somebody up there with a beard and things. It's never made sense to me, even from when I was a child. So I just want to throw that out there because I guess I'm much more existential about we're created, we're here, we exist, and it's a great and wonderful gift, and what you do with the mystery of what you're given is what you do. And I think we have a much more, I feel that I have a much more much more responsibility for how my life turns out than I believe in grace in a different way. I think, and I don't know how to articulate it, but it's the grace that I choose myself to live my life somehow. I guess that, and I don't see being autonomous as being negative. It means that I'm the captain of my own ship, that I do take charge of my own life and I'm responsible for my choices. I can't blame anybody else but myself. So I have all these things floating around inside me, and so I'll just shut up. I just wanted to throw some other ideas out because, you know, like you said, I think it's very idyllic to think that we all start off on our little ship. I think mine probably started off, I might have had a motor and maybe an oar and something, but I still had I knew I wanted to leave. I knew I wanted to go out and explore my life to the best of my ability, and from that you gain some knowledge and sense of yourself, even though you're petrified some of the time, that you can do all this, and you do start to grow and expand, and you meet great teachers along the way, all kinds of great teachers.
I can only echo what you've said and agree with what you've said. You know, yes, there is the ideal and the real, and I think that's part of the mystery and uniqueness of each of our journey. And this world that we live in is imperfect. You know, we're surrounded by imperfection in all of our relationships. And yes, there are many people who get bounced around from the moment that they're born. I remember counseling one gentleman, a leader in one of the communities, and his mother had tried aborting him 5 times while he was in utero. How does that set up someone's mind and their psyche and their spirit to embrace life?
But the fact is, we often do.
Absolutely.
And strongly, and are open and vulnerable and loving people.
One of the what you're saying is that even though people have encountered many things that aren't easy to deal with in life, people do go on to be loving and open and caring and bloom and grow in who they are anyway. And people amaze me. The resilience of the human person just astounds me. What people live through and have come out of and into in their lives is amazing. How many people have not had a solid upbringing in a good family? How many people have had that, realistically? You know, how many people have had the privilege of having an ideal life growing up? I don't know that I've encountered one. Well, yeah. How many people have had a normal family life? How many people have had all of their needs met, emotionally and physically and psychologically, and have had everything in place so that they can be whole and go on into the world with their toolkit fully charged, you know, and fully equipped? How many people have had that opportunity? I don't know one. I know many people who have been bumbled around on the waters, who haven't been equipped and have gone on to the, using your metaphor, who have been sent out on high seas and haven't had the tools in their toolbox and haven't had the blessing and have done wonderfully in their life. And I would say, but by the grace of God, go we sometimes. And who can say how one person has the resilience to deal with the bumps of life? You know, one person can have encountered one experience that would obliterate most of us and pull through it just fine. Another person can go through an experience that seems minor to many of us and will be destroyed. So there's this factor of resiliency and capacity that we haven't even touched on. Human beings are profoundly complex. We're talking about things on a few levels here, but I'm very aware of the complexity of the human condition. And I'm very grateful for the resilience of many people who have come through with the inner voice that you talk about, that you listen to and you follow, and we move towards self-mastery and becoming autonomous and being able to interrelate and choose and exercise our free will.
Just a quick comment first, that I think I once, many years ago, met a person of the kind you described. It was on a long, darkened airplane. It was a long airplane ride at night. We were sitting beside each other, and we started talking, and he told me things about his life that were really, he struck me as the closest thing to like a saint. He was a guy my age, but his life was just, and when I was puzzled about how it was that he was able to do this, to live this kind of life, and he said as we were getting off the plane that he had thought about that a lot in his life. It did strike him that he was singularly blessed, and he said so far as he could see that he had had parents who loved him unconditionally, and it really had been like that. And I was so stunned by what he said that I did this thing that I've kicked myself for ever since. I never got his name. I have no idea who he is. I really wish I had a way to stay in touch with him. But I wanted, if I may, to, while agreeing with you and all of that, to ask you to come back to the issue that Martin raised before, because it's an issue that troubles me. And I want to just start with this, with the observation. When you asked us about happiness or excellent lives before, I suspect that's a question that has to be different for people at different phases of their lives. And so for me and for many of us, we have, at this stage of our lives, alternatives or choices and opportunities, some of which are like freedoms from having to do things. And so I want to put to you specifically, I have in mind, I have a brother whose adopted son, from whom he was estranged, his son suicided as a grown teenager, and my brother spent the rest of his life dealing with that. And I don't know whether it will do as an example, but I'm trying to find an example to pose the issue between you and Martin. So at this point, say, in my life, I want to be attentive to the world around me and to love people around me and to care for the people around me. But it seems to me you and Martin were talking about two really quite different ways of doing that. And I don't want to, I just see an advantage for Martin's that I'd like you to address. The advantage for Martin's is, you know, the apathos, the stoic, cares for the people around him. But when bad things, I mean, you wouldn't give, if that, the stoic apathos, if he was bereaved, you wouldn't give him a bereavement card. Right? Because what he would say to you is, look, it didn't happen to me. The tragedy is the person who died. So in the case of my brother, right, ideally, I would like to be the person for whom, when something like that happened, I would be able to say, nothing really happened to me, something terrible happened to another person, and he's the person for whom one should feel sympathy. That requires a degree of non-self in the relationship, or non-ego. And when you talk about the intensity of the loving relationship, and I resonate like crazy with that, but it seems to me that when we love that way, we are loving ourselves too. And that when we love ourselves too in those ways, it gets just in, I mean, we're loving ourselves, not ourselves alone, but we are loving ourselves in a way that's really quite different from the person who just is free from that and able to see around them what needs doing. But I wonder what your response to that.
Can I just get a little footnote to this? I recall reading Don a number of years ago about the Zen master who's walking with his disciple in the garden. And a servant arrives and announces to the Zen master that his mother has just died. And the Zen master begins to weep. And the student says to him, "Why are you weeping? I thought you were detached." And the Zen master says, "I weep because I wish to weep."
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to
Amen.
pick up on this?
I think what David has said is profound and needs to just soak in for a few minutes. You know, the attachment that one feels in communion isn't a self-absorption, isn't isn't one of me. There's a difference between empathy and sympathy. Where empathy is me being able to be with another in a compassionate way, and sympathy taking on much more of the other. You know, in a Christian context, in communion, there is a suffering because the other has suffered. And it isn't me that's suffering, but that in a way, as one communion, I suffer too. But it isn't a self-absorbed suffering. And I wouldn't use the word detached either. Because for me, it's antinomic. It's a mystery of being a yes but, an and or. It's a both. It's not black and white. It's not a non, it's not a complete. It's mystery. Where I weep because I choose to weep because I feel the loss of the other. You know, and I could go into a number of things in terms of the suicide issue, and that goes back to your question, you know, and you raised it early in terms of perhaps talking about suicide would clarify things. I don't think I want to go there right now because it's untimely, because it could take us another good number of hours to go through. But when there's a loss in suicide, there's a trauma that happens to the individual that's lost someone that I don't want to undermine in any way. There's a post-traumatic stress of a loss. And that operates on a different level, no matter how stoic one wants to be about it, frankly. Shy of someone choosing to be absolutely, completely detached and emotionally non-responsive. But I'll just say that there are other elements that go on that make that question more complicated.
I think that's right, too.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So much to say, so much has been talked about. First of all, thank you to David and Martin for setting all of this up in the first place. And I applaud you for an excellent speech today. I have certainly learned much through this activity. Shakespeare, there is death in the pot. Why am I thinking of that? Yeah, it's food. But food can kill me. And henceforth, the idea that human life is a conflict. The very thing that we need, we talked about attachment, I used the term attachment, which is a specific kind of relationship, to then broadly talk about relationship, that it would appear that it's relationship that makes me who I am, that makes me human. That in fact, thinking back, John Bowlby, when he wrote his paper, he was studying infants and children, very young children, in their interactions with their mothers. But it would seem that attachment or relationships in general is not something that we need to build up and achieve this thing called security in infancy and childhood, but also we need that to carry us through for the remainder of our lives, hopefully to our graves. However, this very thing that we need, just like food that we need, is the very thing that can harm us. People talk about attachment, and in psychiatry there is known as attachment disorders or detachment disorders. I suppose one can be a lack of attachment and results in suffering some sort of psychiatric disorder. Or one can be attached erroneously and henceforth suffer. And or even worse, suffering as a result of harmful or abusive attachments such as incest. So what is this thing called relationships and that we all need so much? Well, if once I loved and have been hurt, then the defense would be, I shall never love at all. Because then that would prevent me from ever getting hurt from loving again. Similarly, if I have a relationship and got hurt, as you were explaining, Perhaps if I build no relationships, then I will never get hurt again. Yes, it's conceivable that I can live a life without relationships, zero, but it would not be an excellent life. So what about then having relationships and having good relationships, and through that to achieve an excellent life? I don't know if it's such a thing as an excellent life, maybe a good life. What I think I've heard so far is that maybe for lacking the possibility of achieving an excellent life, perhaps I can shoot for a well-adjusted life. What I think I've heard is that I have choices to make. Depending on the choices I make, depending on how I manage all my traumas and all my bad relationships, therefore I can still achieve a relatively well-adjusted life. A life that I can steer, a life that I can gain meaning and or value from what I choose and how I live. Maybe it's not so much do I need a deep attachment to achieve an excellent life. Perhaps one should be more reflective. I think it wasn't quite said, but essentially an examined life. The suggestion there is that I should develop as an adult some sort of self-reflective function. And in this self-reflection, one has to consider all sorts of things, including philosophy. Whatsoever good is what I think good, is what I do good, is what I eat good, is what I relate to good. And what do I do with all the bad objects? If I manage these things well, perhaps then I would have achieved a satisfying, satisfactory, and well-adjusted life. Excellence, maybe, maybe not. The idea of excellence means that there's a goal, there's this place, there's this standard, there's this measurement that I have to arrive at in order to be that. But perhaps the process, the way to get there is more important than being there.
That was very well said. I think that I appreciate what you've pulled together and summarized from all of that. I'm going to posit though one more thing on top of what you said, because I think that what you've pointed out is a distinction between the real and the ideal, working with what we live with and what we aim for, what we seek. Each of us is on a path that we go somewhere in our life, between now and when we die, and for some after death. And the process is, how do we go from here to there? And part of it may be becoming well-adjusted and being functional and being able to have meaning and purpose and value and integration in our lives, and knowing what to do with the bad objects in our life, knowing how to connect and how to relate. Some people will choose to relate to things rather than human beings as we go along in our life. I think more so one of my questions about the excellent life is, what do I strive for? What's my goal? What's my aim? Where am I going? What's the end point and why? And my other question is that end point a what or a who? And that's a big difference. And the what is characterological. The who is relational. And it'll depend on how each of us views that. Many of the spiritual traditions and philosophical traditions will paint out a path. Some will be intellectual, some will be rational, some will be governed by different disciplines and characters that we develop along the way. Some will be to move towards detachment, in fact. Some will be to move towards attachment. In the Christian tradition, we move towards attachment, not detachment. Although we move towards apatheia, in the Greek term, which means a detachment from those things that bind us and impassion us. Those things that hold us back from living the true, excellent life, whatever that may be. So I think there is the characterological goal of what we may leave, but then the ideal of what are we truly striving for, and is that a what or a who? And is the who you or I, is the who God?
Thank you. I just had one quick observation to make, actually, and that is going back to the original question here, the relationship of deep attachments to the excellent life. Again, not to want to be a spoiler on this matter, but I'm always very aware of the negative and the conflictual implications of a lot of this stuff. And I grew up in a community which had very deep personal and communal attachments. But it took me a while to realize that the community which offered me such love and such a self-affirmation looked down on all sorts of other people. I grew up in a very anti-Semitic environment as an Irish Catholic, for example. I grew up believing that black people were little more than children and should be the object of our pity and our compassion. And so the big struggle, I think, for many of us who grow up in these cloistered sets of deep attachments is realizing that we have to break out of them for issues of social justice. And this, I wanted to introduce the notion of justice because I hadn't heard that so far. So I think one of the traps of this is that those of us who kind of want to jump out of the Catholic the kind of traditional Catholicism or any traditional religion which erects barriers and loves those within the walls but doesn't feel quite so charitably about those outside. A lot of us make the mistake of jumping into other organizations which proclaim all the opposite virtues, the ones that we feel are missing from our original, only to find that the new organizations betray our trust in various ways as we continue to mature. And so I suppose I look upon this to a certain extent, and I'm trying to pull together the kind of the image of the sailor in the boat of Odysseus, if you like, which our friend made here, and of the Stoic view here, because it seems to me we are all, in a sense, engaged upon a path of personal evolution, in which we move from the attachments of our primary relationships into the attachments of secondary relationships, which we make with people from more remote and distant regions, ultimately even embracing tertiary relationships. Because, for example, when Nelson Mandela was in prison for 29 years, he still relied upon his sense of connection to the public struggle, to the sacrifice he was making for his people, even on a set of tertiary relationships. So I think for me, the answer for someone who doesn't believe in God, although I do believe in the devil, that's maybe a paradox which we can explore later. I think it's like a personal evolution, moving from the early uncritical deep attachments, which can often be very negative and parochial in some ways because they favor some and they don't favor others. And we move towards a kind of universalization, perhaps, of our values, which seek to embrace everyone, which of course is what all the major religions claim to do, but very few of them actually, in practice, always accomplish that. So I see this, I think the Stoics are right in saying that we should not bind ourselves to these attachments in ways which make us dependent upon some or subordinate. We should learn that each of our relationships, in a sense, is a relationship of limited liability. That we have a certain relationship with our political comrades to do certain work. We have a relationship with our sons and daughters and husbands and wives for other reasons. But we learn the difficult lesson that no single relationship is going to be all-consuming. No relationship can give us everything we want. That's basically the lesson I've learned.
And also you've illuminated us on the fact that Irish Catholics actually have the devil as God, right? Your theological insights are always so right on. I just love it. We're really coming to a close. Do you want to final remark? And
What does one say after all of that? Did you have fun?
Yes.
Was this engaging for you?
Yes.
If there's one thing you're taking away from this discussion, what is it? Silence fills the room.
New insight into Irish Catholic theology.
One word. If there's one word you're taking with you from today, what is it?
I'm still at a 0.
I wasn't asking for a number, I was asking for a word.
Oedipus Rex.
Sorry?
Oedipus Rex is what I'm taking.
Oedipus Rex.
Cherish the love in your life.
Cherish the love in your life.
Sail on.
Sail on. Other words?
Prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and accept what comes. Prepare for the worst, expect the best, and accept what comes.
And yours was, sir?
Love.
Love.
I have 3.
3?
No God needed.
No God needed.
I have 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Other words? You're welcome. I just want to thank you for the privilege of coming. It was an honor to spend some time with you. I think my word is similar to yours, and that's love. And my hope and my prayer earnestly is that each of us, as this first day of the rest of our lives, can grow and become all that we choose with whatever is within us and outside of us, all that we can be, and that you find whatever is the excellent life for you, that you can move towards that and become that in ways that are beyond your wildest dreams, and that everything that you desire in your heart truly unfolds in reality in an incarnate way around you. So I just, again, thank you for that privilege, and truly earnestly pray that if there be anything that binds you and colors your glasses, that holds you back from being able to be who you are, that be known to you, and that you have the grace and the strength and the courage and the fortitude to push through that so that you can see truth and life and love for all that it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzette. This ends this series of Philosopher Cafes. We are planning a series for the fall, and we will let you know. Any of you who have not, who do not get the Ronnie Center email announcements, you're welcome to fill this out and give it to me or to Rebecca, and we'll add your list or your name to the list, and you will hear about them in due time. Lovely to have all of you on board. Thanks so much.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
could I suggest a round of applause for these guys who are organizing?
Thank you, David, for the invitation to come. I just have one more tiny thing to say. For those of you who wish to, I'm going to be offering a talk at St. Joseph's College at the University of Alberta here on Thursday afternoon at 3:30 till 5 at St. Joseph's College on expanding on some of the ideas that I shared today, particularly around Philosophia and those things that hold us back, who we are created according to the image and likeness of a triune God from a Christian perspective, those things that hold us back from life and how we can move forward in our lives. So those of you who are interested in attending, please feel free to come.
And also, we want to thank Steeps and our good colleagues at Steeps for all they do for us. Thanks so much.
Yeah.